forced theme, but again, once they started talking about it, we were able to see some of the things that they talked about, and obviously their attitude and their own personality and style of learning did have something to do with, you know, if I have to be writing so that I can learn, or I have to be writing so that I am participating or staying engaged. And you know, I do have a responsibility to my work, and so several of the students were saying those kinds of things, that does play a part in engagement. Okay? And so then we took these themes, as I said, and we went and started doing the quantitative piece.
So this was kind of in our next semester. So we used these themes and we created 5 different sections, and we were wanted to develop a scale. And a Likert scale is the kind of scale where it's like strongly disagree to strongly agree, okay, however you set it up. Having 5 statements is best. You do want a neutral statement. Some people, there's some literature that supports not to, but sometimes people are indifferent to it. And so we had these 5 themes, and then we wanted to come up with some statements for each theme. So, for example, what we did was we went into the transcripts and we found student quotes. So if we came up with a statement for relevance, you know, we wanted to say something like, the instructor in this class makes the material relevant to, or just makes it relevant, okay? And you either strongly disagree to strongly agree. And, you know, we tried to, each of us on our own went into the transcripts, tried to come up with some statements for each one. And we ended up with 30 statements. So we had about 6 statements for 5 categories. I think we actually ended up with 31. There was one we loved, so we had to keep that in there. And so then we put together what we liked as our survey after we all agreed. There were 5 of us on the team. So we went back and forth. We wanted to make sure the statements were clear. And not, you know, sometimes when you make statements it can kind of include 2 things. You know, we wanted to make sure they were really, you know, addressed towards relevance. And so then we took this and we went into the student union and we grabbed 20 students. We were supposed to do 20. I think we ended up with 1 extra.
We couldn't say no. We had extra pizza.
Because we were serving pizza and we had gift cards and stuff for them. But they came in and we wanted them to take the survey. And as they were taking it, write down any comments. Like, this was confusing. I didn't understand this. So they took the survey, ate their pizza. And then afterwards, we debriefed with them. They met with one of the 5 researchers. And, you know, we went through, and I think, and the ones that I was debriefing with, they all had something to say. You know, all had comments. You know, we wanted them to think about a particular class, and obviously it's directed towards a specific class because every class is going to have a different level of engagement. So we had one student who had just come from walking. She was like, that'd be really hard to talk about how engaged I was in my walking class or whatever. So it helped us to make some changes to the survey based on this feedback, just some phrasing things and being specific about this or that. And but it helped. It helped with the readability and then how to apply it to courses, how we were going to ask them to focus on a specific class, you know, to answer it. And that was a part of that follow-up interview that we did with them.
Yeah, and this is an important step in survey the validity. When you're creating a survey, you want to make sure it's valid. So you go to the people who are going to, you know, who are the experts. And so for us, students were the experts because that's who would be taking this survey. In this particular, you know, we had other experts as us, but then we wanted to see what they, you know, again, what they would have to say about it.
Right, so you want to make sure your survey is reliable in the sense that it's yielding the same result time after time. But most importantly, you want to make sure it's valid, that it's actually, when we say these students are engaged, it's actually showing engagement and not excitement or something else. So, you know, taking it back to them and making sure that that was the case is what we did here. And it was a pretty quick thing. We did it at the end of the semester. So this is kind of a sample, and we have these printed, we can get to you, but this is just a sample of the survey that we put together. We put it in SurveyMonkey, and here's some of the statements. Now we decided to have some negative statements, they're called reverse items, so that you don't just go through and put strongly agree, all the way down, right? So you want to have some reverse items so that students actually have to think about each one. So it was part of our 6 for each section, but we just put not or doesn't, in some of them. So you can see a few of those, speaking to the professor, and but we mixed them all up, so they weren't necessarily in an order. So we put that on SurveyMonkey, and then we, in the spring, we went into classes again, and we asked professors to send the link for students to take the survey. And we had a total of 177 students participate. And we asked them to think about that class in which they were taking the survey. So if it was, their freshman English class, that's what they had in mind when they took it. And we collected some demographic information, how large is this class? Is this class a class required for your degree? Is this a class, just as an elective, or is it a core class that you have to take? Because that could speak to their engagement, just what they come in with. Of course, we asked age, gender, and that kind of thing as well. But we had 177 participate. We did offer a gift card. I think we did a drawing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For 2.
And then we, so what we did we wanted to, this was really exploratory, right? We were creating a brand new measure, trying to find out something that we didn't already know, that wasn't in the literature. And so instead of saying, these are the categories that it must fit into, we approached it as telling the software to tell us where these statements fit. So the way it does that, it's called an exploratory factor analysis, and it's a statistical method, an advanced statistical method. And it looks at profiles. So for these 177 students, if they answer strongly agree to 1, then they should answer strongly agree to something that's similar, right? Mm-hmm. My professor's passionate about the course. My professor feels strongly about conveying the material of the course. You should strongly agree to both of those. You're not going to agree to one and not agree to the other, okay? So using a Varimax rotation, which is just how some of the data is rotated within it, the program, it's called SPSS, forces it into categories, and they're called factors. So it tells you for each question how that question loads onto a factor. And it ended up giving us, 5 factors total, where it had certain items fitting more strongly. But what we decided, and that's what's interesting about exploratory, and it does kind of take quantitative to a little towards qualitative. At this point, you can make some decisions. You don't just have to look at the data to say this is the answer. You can bring in some of your own understanding of the literature, like this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. So we had 2 factors where most of the questions loaded.
I think it was 9 and 9 on the first 2 factors.
So there was, one factor that had 2 statements that loaded, and strangely, our negative statements loaded onto factors together. So I think that students were confused with the negative statements, but that's something that we learned. So really, there were 2 factors that were the strongest, and they accounted for 42% of the variance of all. So we just decided to keep those 2 factors, which we labeled as teaching persona, okay, and this is things about the professor. The professor's approachable, the professor knows our names, the professor's passionate about the subject, things about the professor. We really struggled with naming it. You have to, of course, name what the factors are, but we thought, because we kind of went back with what professor traits, or it's kind of personality things, but then there's also passion and
and it was what happened. We had these 5 original categories that we had put together that we had all worked on so hard, and it was really difficult to give those up because we cared about those. And but in looking across, like teaching persona, there were things from the relevance category, there were things from the professor trait, and there were things from class climate that all were factored together under this one factor. And so that sort of, I think that was the hard part about it too, is because we saw them in these other areas, but students maybe were seeing them as similar things.
Right. So things about the professor being passionate, they answered in the same way as the professor makes this meaningful to us. Well, when you're passionate, you make things meaningful, that makes sense. But, instead of us telling it how we wanted it to, because you can force it into certain factors. We let it, you know, do how it wanted, and I think found a more real meaning of the data. So then the other factor we had was learning environment, which is the actual class itself. So what the activities that we would say, and you know, they put us into group work, they help us to make these connections.
Assignments are relevant.
Yeah, assignments are relevant to the course. The professor doesn't just teach from the book, but adds other things. So it's more talking about like the actual structure of the class rather than the person who's teaching it. So these are the two things that we came up with. There were 9 factors on each, as Dr. Miller said, but when we actually looked at those factors, some of them were pretty much identical, you know, saying the same thing. So we eliminated, and some were kind of confusing. There was, what was the word? There was a word that we just didn't like. So we got rid of a couple and ended up with 6 items per factor. So we got rid of 3 each. So here we started out with 31 items, and now we're down to 12 for our scale. And so this was the final scale that we came up with, and this was what, 3 days ago? And we have two factors. You know, students are engaged, and what we also did decide 2 things. We decided the student traits, which was what we were after in the first place. That really didn't belong on this scale. You know, that needs to be a different scale. This is how professors can lead students to be engaged in class, okay? By their persona, being excited, making it, you know, interesting, and by structuring the class in a certain way. These are the ways that professors can make their course engaging. But then we need to have another separate scale for what students can do. You know, this is what you can do, or this is what professors can do to help students prepare and be more engaged. So we just decided it was really a separate idea and didn't need to be on the same scale. And then there were 2 factors that loaded into something like relevance, but they were both negative statements. And so I think our plan for the future, we just submitted this as a proposal to a conference yesterday. But our next step is to add kind of a 3rd factor for relevance. So what you do, you know, we ran the factor analysis and we ran reliability analyses, you know, on each factor, and, I'm sorry, on each item within the factor. And, you know, they had strong reliability.